I love this saying. I'm not quite sure who started the saying, but what it boils down to is one day the poor will feed on the carcass of the rich. The poor would have nothing to eat, so they would have nothing to do but to feed on the carcass of the rich. There's something satisfying about that, and whatever the reasons or whatever the things, maybe this is just the lefty in me that says something is completely and utterly satisfying about this. Apparently I am not alone in this assessment, and maybe not one day, maybe it is soon, maybe it is coming up within the political space itself, meaning this idea of mine, this feeling of mine that is in the core of my leftyism, that one day the poor will feed on the carcass of the rich. Maybe that one day is soon, especially since we have people in the political space who are embracing it, and not just people in the political space that are embracing it, that the idea is apparently popular and gaining traction. Ocasio-Cortez floated in a 60-minute interview that there should be a top tax rate of 70%. Now, this doesn't mean that the entire income, meaning if somebody makes $10 million, that the entirety of the $10 million is tax. It's a percentage of that $10 million gets the 70% tax rate. Fact of the matter is, when FDR was in office, FDR was pushing for like a 100% tax rate and was able to compromise to be like 98% or 99%, some insane amount. And it got whittled away. I think at Reagan it was like at 70%, but it was whittled away. She's floated the idea. This idea was called radical. This idea was called, oh God, this is over the board. Forgetting the historical precedent of the fact that this was law at one point. It's as if something that's happened and somewhat of a recent occurrence becomes as if it's always been this way. Same thing with ICE. They act like ICE has always been this way. It is not. And somebody coming in, particularly a DSA member, saying, hey, maybe we should have the tax rate at 70%. Come to find out, though, this idea that they call radical, this idea that they call, oh God, this would never happen, this idea that was off the wall, this idea that would never happen, that used to be the law of the land, has support by the majority of the population, including a large share of Republicans. When Ocasio floated this, they act like she was insane. But just like with Sanders, where a lot of the stuff that he's saying, when you ask the public turns out agrees. This is no different. I've joked, kind of joke, about eat the rich. When 95% of the wealth went to the top 1%, there is a problem with the system that has allowed 95% of the wealth that went to the top go to the top 1%, and that needs to be discussed, evaluated, and the public needs to make a determination on what it wants to do with this regard, not just be hidden by mainstream media and political space that don't want to talk about this because all of them are millionaires and billionaires. Take a look at this new poll that just came out. If, give me 1 second, my display is acting up, my OBS. Jesus Christ. I will edit this part out. Alright, right here. There we are. The majority of Americans support the top tax rate to 70%. Could take that top rate higher, let me tell it. Representative Ocasio-Cortez and her Republican critics have called her proposal to dramatically increase America's highest rate radical. If it's radical, then the American population is radical. And if the overwhelming majority of the American population is for it, it means that the people who are in office who are, let's say, have a vested interest in this, are against it. It's possible that they're against it because of their vested interests. When you're talking to the American public itself, the American public is on board. I love this. In the latest The Hill-Harris X survey, conducted January 12th and 13th after the newly elected Congresswoman called for the U.S. to raise the highest tax rate to 70%, a sizable majority of registered voters, 59%, supports the concept. You don't say! It's not radical at all. It's perfectly in line with the American public and what the public wants. It's just the political space doesn't give the public what it wants. You have these radical centrists who wouldn't even bring it up. Ocasio-Cortez has not introduced any legislation to enact the concept, but surveys shows that a broad section of Americans support it, at least presently. And she talks about this. Ocasio is among a group of progressive legislators, which includes Sanders, who have called for increasing the federal income tax rates on the wealthy Americans. The New York Democrat kicked off a debate within her party in a January 6th interview with 60 Minutes, during which she said she would support setting it at a higher tax, which includes individuals' $10th million of income at 70%. Now she talks about this. Let her speak her piece.
And it's not enough just for us to talk about it and to say, hey, the gap between the rich and the poor is a problem. But the way that it translates into a policy solution is a marginal tax rate. Marginal tax rates, one of the most effective ways to stem income inequality is through a marginal tax rate on the highest brackets of income, what the vast majority of Americans will ever, even experience right now. So obviously there's a lot more that goes into a policy and a platform to tackle income inequality, but a marginal tax rate is a cornerstone policy of that. So first of all, I don't think it's a case that I have to make, because it's a case that the majority of Americans have already made. This is a policy that is already popular, and it's time that we embrace working Americans, and it's time that the Democratic Party fights in a full-throated manner for the working class in the United States.
She said it is time that the Democratic Party fight in a full-throated manner for the United States. This is not a policy I need to even push. This is a policy that the American public already agrees with. And why wouldn't they agree with? The overwhelming majority of Americans are not going to have $10 million. The overwhelming majority of Americans don't even have $500 in the bank. And so if you're making this argument that, hey, 95% of the wealth went to the top 1%, you're the ones that do the labor, you're the ones that do all the work, you're the ones that make sure this society functions, shouldn't you share in the benefits of this particular society? Not just that, it doesn't affect you. For the 99% of the population who we're talking about, this doesn't affect. Shouldn't that money, instead of sitting in the bank, be used for... If we're honestly having this conversation about environmental degradation, shouldn't we do something about environmental degradation? If we're honestly having this conversation about public infrastructure, where the water is being degraded, where highways, railways, bridges, all of these things are falling apart, and the federal government continues to just borrow more and more money. Instead of borrowing more and more money, shouldn't we consider, A, doing something about income inequality, doing something about having people's lives who haven't improved, meaning the standard of living, the amount of money that they have in the bank and resources available to them over the past 20, 30 years hasn't improved, whereas the standards for the top 1% has skyrocketed. Shouldn't that change? If we're honestly having a conversation about income inequality in this country, shouldn't we do something about it? If we're honestly having this conversation about environmental regulation, shouldn't we do something about it? But all of those things is the federal government spending more within regards to the lower part of the economic scale. And yes, if someday the poor will feed on the carcass of the rich, maybe that someday is today. And by the way, a 70% marginal tax rate there's a big difference between feeding on the carcass of the rich, or the fat of the rich, as opposed to a 70% tax rate. A 70% tax rate isn't going to kill anybody. And like I said, it used to be policy in the United States before. I love it. I love it. I'm a lefty, and of course, the left tends to want to go further on this, but I like it, and I'll take it. And apparently, the overwhelming majority of the American public also backs her on this. So, good job for bringing this up. Good job for moving the political discourse. Make sure y'all like Jamarl videos. You know how these algorithms work. Oh, thanks, Pop Reality. Thank you, man. I appreciate the heads up. All right, guys. If you enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. And you can always support through PayPal or Patreon. Is anyone having any environmental arguments? Well, even the 1% starts at $300,000 a year. This is a tax on the top 0.01%. Yeah, that's another thing that you kind of need to make clear. The overwhelming majority, meaning 99 point something percent of the population, this will never affect. Three-way. Do you think Bernie will run as a third party once Democrats screw him out of the nomination? What do you think his chances are as a third party candidate? I don't think his chances as a third party candidate are that high. Like, I keep thinking of Wallace, Henry Wallace. Like, and don't get me wrong, if Sanders ran as a third party candidate, I would support him as a third party candidate. I'm talking about just the chances or the pragmatic chances of what do I think is going to take place if he runs as a third party candidate. I think people are extraordinarily indoctrinated for a two-party system. If you get to the point where people are just so fed up that they're willing to overcome whatever is in them that prevents that third party thing, then yeah, Sanders' chances are awesome. But whatever his chances as a third party without that, I don't know, man. My appraisal of that doesn't go that high. That was a question for Seema. Oh, I will ask her that, Balthazar. I'm going to send her that question. See what she says. I'm curious about that myself. I'm going to send her that question and see what she says. Alright. I'm going to end this. If you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support through PayPal or Patreon. I'm going to be back a little bit later. I have a clinic appointment today, but I'll be back a little bit later. I'll also have an interview at 3 on, well, it's not really an interview, but I'm going to be hanging out with By Any Means Necessary on Sputnik. So, you all have a good one, and I'll see you in a few. Thanks all. And we are...